Hi, everyone. I'm Penny Gordon-Larson, and I'm pleased to be here on behalf of our session. This is a joint session with TOS and the European Association. So both of us, obesity associations, working together. And we had a really wonderful meeting when we were at our last TOS meeting and started to really come together, bring the two groups together in a much more meaningful way than we had before. So we talked a lot about science, and we built a session that we thought would be interesting and touch on many of the different areas of science that we're covering in terms of global obesity. So there's a couple of things I have to do that are business-wise. I am supposed to tell you that that you are not supposed to take pictures or film, and we will be having the session run as a set of the 5 speakers, and then we'll go to a discussion session. So in the discussion session, we'll all just come up at the end and allow people to have more in-depth questions. So we'll have time for a couple of questions in between each of the talks, but then we'll have a much greater discussion at the end. And I'll let each speaker, as they come up, take the questions from the audience, these, just 1 or 2 quick questions, and then we'll move to the next speaker. So in this session, I'll be speaking first, and I'll be talking about urbanization in China, and then John Speakman will speak about fast food restaurants and obesity, Ted Kyle on weight bias, Arnie Astrup on personalized diet management, and then we'll finish with Simone Barquer on regulatory efforts in Mexico and Chile. So I will go ahead and get started. So I'll be speaking about urbanization in China, and I'll touch on diet and omics and speak in relation to cardiometabolic disease. So I have no commercial conflicts. And the question that I'm asking in this talk today is really, how exactly does urbanization affect health? So we know that there's these well-documented urban-rural differences in cardiometabolic health and in obesity, but what's really less well known are how exactly urbanization-related factors impact health. So that's largely because there are gaps in methodologies that allow us to study these full pathways and look at the complexity, the direct and indirect relationships, to see how exactly urbanization relates to health outcomes. There's also been a fair amount of gaps in the breadth of data from molecular to behavior to environment levels. So bringing all of that together to really understand urbanization and health is critical. So we're doing just that in the China Health and Nutrition Survey, and this is a multi-stage random cluster drawn sample that we've been following for over 25 years. It's a very large sample, as you can see across the bottom. We're following folks from 1989 all the way to 2015, and we have around 20,000 people in the study. We originally drew from these 9 provinces that are here in the darker green, and it's a household-based survey, but we also have a very deep range of clinical and individual data, as well as household and community-level data on a range of economic, social, behavioral, and biological data. So China is characterized with this very rapid change in urbanization, and things unfold very quickly in China, and so we are fortunate in our study in the China Health and Nutrition Survey to be able to capture this dynamic change over time. And that change has been accompanied with an increase in BMI over time, and when we look at the effect of being a 40-year-old, say now in our younger cohorts, versus being a 40-year-old about 40 or 50 years ago, the average BMI at age 40 is about 1.5 units larger in our younger cohorts. So the younger cohorts are now being exposed to a higher BMI over a longer period of the life course than they ever have before. And that, of course, is going to have some major impacts down the road. There's also been a major change in the way people eat in China. So this is data from Barry Popkin looking across rural, small city, big city, and mega cities. And you can see that the proportion of foods coming from home-based meals really declines with urbanization. So in the megacities, our most developed areas, less than half of the food that people consume is coming from homemade foods in the house. And then the majority really is from processed foods or eating away from home. And all of those are usually less healthy, energy dense, higher in fat, different kinds of foods that are being consumed. So this rapid and uneven urbanization really unfolds differently across different parts of China. And you can't really capture this by saying, urban versus rural. So we've developed an urbanization index that takes into account the diversity of changes, sanitation, modern markets, traditional markets, the transportation infrastructure, education, economics, so forth. And so we look at those and we find that in many places, the kinds of urbanization changes are quite different. So you can get some areas that roads develop quickly and then followed by markets later. In other areas, markets may develop on the scene first and other kinds of factors later. And so we're teasing that apart and looking at the precise kinds of factors and how they might relate to health. And so just as an example here, this is looking at the odds of diabetes across these components of urbanization. And as you read down, you can see that for men, the odds of diabetes are higher with more modern markets, with communications, housing infrastructure, sanitation, economic activity, education, and education and income diversity. Whereas for women, we really only saw a higher odds of diabetes with sanitation. So obviously these can present some kinds of targets for us the more we know about them, and we're scratching the surface of this at this point in time. What we're aiming to do in the work that we're doing is really to look at these pathways and look at the complexity. We're using structural equation modeling, and this is a very simplified diagram here, but to really understand the pathways and how urbanization may bear its influence. So we take things like the community factors, and those are the urbanization-related factors, household factors, individual factors. And this is simplistic because you can have, for example, we can look at what is the effect of being low income in a highly urbanized community versus being low income. So it doesn't matter your income in the development of your community. And we can look at these, how these influence the behaviors related to obesity. And we can carry that out to body weight, and we can carry that out to an outcome like hypertension. And the interesting thing about these kinds of models is that we can look at the pathway from urbanization through behavior, more of an energy kind of pathway through body weight to hypertension, and we can take that apart and say, given that pathway, what is the direct pathway of diet, either diet patterns or sodium or any kind of nutrient that we might be interested. Similarly, we do the same for physical activity. And I'll show you an example of this. So this is one tiny little piece of that puzzle, and here we're looking at urbanization as it relates to BMI in 2009, as well as a change over 20 years in BMI. And here just breaking down caloric intake, Western diet, traditional diet, occupational and domestic activity. And again, we're looking at the effect of the level of that at the final period, but also the change over time. And when we look at this for urbanization to BMI, for diet, we can see that the urbanization pathway seems to be coming much more for the types of foods, the pattern of food that people eat, as opposed to purely energy intake. So there's something about the adoption of a modern high wheat kind of diet and the traditional Southern diet changes that relate to BMI. And we see the direct effect of caloric intake, but really over time, urbanization seems to be bearing an influence on the types of foods people consume. For physical activity, we see that urbanization seems to be operating through occupational activity and the changes in occupational activity to affect BMI. And so these dramatic changes here are carried through to BMI, and there's a direct effect of domestic activity, and this is for men. The findings in females are different, but just for brevity's sake, I'm showing this. So what happens at the molecular level underlying some of these changes? And so we can look at what's going on in the gut microbiome and in the metabolome to look at how some of these kinds of changes may influence what we see under the skin. And we're using, we've actually been collecting fecal samples and sequencing those samples. We have 10,000 stored samples in the study, which is really quite amazing, all over China for our sample. And so far we have about 5,000 sequenced, but I'm not going to show you those data now. I'm just going to show you a small portion of adults, 40 adults from Hunan province. And we picked this province because we wanted to get neighboring individuals, urban and rural adults who live close to each other, so they have the same kind of dietary traditions and exposed to kind of similar environments, and that the only things that differ are really the stage of development. We have fasting plasma metabolomics, and we have fecal samples collected 2 weeks apart. I'll show you today the 16S sequencing as well as the whole genome metagenome sequencing. And Anthony Fodor from University of North Carolina at Charlotte is really the mastermind behind this. He's amazing and has been a fabulous collaborator on the project. So here, just to show you that indeed these are really quite different areas in Hunan, very different in terms of their population, their income, birth rate, and so forth, and in the metadata. So you can see that they, the urban individuals already have higher insulin, waist circumference, BMI, and HbA1c. So this is a lot, but it's actually very simple. So this is showing you the, if we look across, this is going down the taxonomic levels to about here. And here showing the breakdown of the pattern of what's in the gut by the urban versus rural. So rural is in blue, and red is the urban, and basically what you're looking for is the distinction between these, where you see that the blues are together and the reds are together. And then next to each is a diversity index showing the diversity of the microbes in the gut. And so as you go down, you can see that they're really different, what is in the patterning of what's in the gut, as well as the diversity of those microbes. And when you look at the archaea and the viruses, and these we get with our whole genome metagenome, you can see that the profiles are very different for urban versus rural dwellers. So for urban, it's much less varied, and in fact, we see more of the deleterious viruses, and the reduction is probably due to antibiotic intake, which is much higher in the urban area. When we compare them to American populations, this is the Human Microbiome Project, and you can see that we find the same bugs in the urban and rural individuals, but we find much more diversity across the rural, and when you get to the prevalence, the urban have a much higher prevalence of the American kind of bugs. The metabolome also is similarly discriminatory here with the rural versus urban, and so this just shows that the circulating metabolites in the bloodstream are very different in urban and rural dwellers. And 10 of the 16 significantly different metabolites that we found were involved in lipid, carbohydrate, and energy metabolism, which of course are major features of an urban diet. And here, this is showing the amount of classification for urban versus rural that you can get, how well you can classify based only on some of these data. So I'll draw your attention to the metabolite and metadata, which is this light blue line. So if you only knew somebody's characteristics and their metabolome, you would be able to very easily identify if they were from a rural or urban environment. So the implications of this work is that we have very different microbiome and metabolome in recently urbanized and rural individuals from Hunan. And our findings really suggest a potential convergent evolution in the US and urban Chinese population. So we have very similar patterns of abundant microbes, probably through similar lifestyles on different continents. And the question we need to ask next is really, do these changes relate to changes that accompany urbanization, such as diabetes, obesity, inflammatory bowel disease, and cancers? And the next steps for us are to tie in these microbial and metabolomic data into those pathway models to see exactly how these factors are being influenced. So I'll end by thanking my collaborators from UNC, Barry Popkin, who is at the meeting but not here at the moment, Linda Adair, Annie Green Howard, Elizabeth Kaler, and then folks from UNC Charlotte, Anthony Fodor, Wei Xia, and Catherine Wingley, as well as our Chinese collaborators, Drs. Wang, Zhang, and Ding, and Feng Yang, and our collaborators from Penn, Drs. Wu and Drs. Li, and our funders, NIDDK, NICHD, and NHLBI. So thank you. And I have time to answer one or two quick questions. Any questions? Well, if there's no questions, we can move to the next speaker, which is John Speakman. And he is going to be speaking about fast food and obesity.
So we move rapidly from somebody from the States speaking about China to me from the UK speaking about the States, and I work most of my time in China as well, so it's truly a global perspective. So what I want to talk about is fast food and obesity, and whether they're guilty as charged or whether we're falsely accusing them. So these are my declarations. I think it's really important before you get this talk that you know that I have nothing to do with the fast food industry. I don't work for them. I've never ever had a grant from them. I don't hold any stock in any fast food companies. In fact, I don't even like fast food. We were working out how many McDonald's I've actually eaten in my whole life, and I think it's probably less than 20. So that's important that you know that before I actually give the talk. Okay, so as you all know, the obesity epidemic is a recent event. It's happened in the last 50 years or so, and it's an ongoing event. And what you can see from this graph is that the trends are the same whether you base them on self-report, which are these blue and orange lines here, or whether you base it on actual measurements. People obviously tell lies about how tall and how much they weigh, but they consistently tell lies. So they're always about 5% lower in prevalence when you calculate it on self-report. And we know that body fatness is closely related to the risk of developing chronic disease. So this is some data on diabetes from the 90s, showing that once you get to sort of morbid obesity, that the risk in males is about 43 times higher, and in females is about 93 times higher. So the consequence of that causal linkage between obesity and diabetes is that diabetes trends follow the same pattern as the obesity trend. So what happens is, in the 80s, Americans were about 4% diabetes, but now they're around about 10%. And that temporal coincidence, so this is the rate of diabetes plotted against the rate of obesity for each of those years since the 1980s, that relationship reflects that causal link between the two. So looking at that trend through time, it's tempting to sort of say that something must have happened around about the 1950s. Something happened in our food environment in the 1950s that kind of changed things and caused us to sort of put on weight. So this is my mom and dad in 1945 when they got married. And we don't know what the people in that picture were actually eating in 1945. But one thing that we can be absolutely certain is that at the point that picture was taken, none of those people had ever eaten a fast food meal. And the reason that we know that is because fast food was virtually non-existent in the 1940s. The first McDonald's opened in 1953 in California, but there was still only about 100, by 1960, there was still only about 100 McDonald's in the whole world. But it's kind of exploded, and so if you look at the numbers that there are now, in 2016, there's now 14,000 branches of McDonald's across the US. First KFC opened in 1930. There's now about 5,000 of them, about 5,600 Taco Bells. If you look across those outlets, they now sell 15 million fast food meals every single day. And if you add in all the other fast food outlets, it's about 60 million fast food meals that are being served that were not being served in the 1940s and 1950s. And if you plot, and what's annoying about this field is that the data is there for the number of fast food restaurants, but you have to buy commercial reports in order to get to it. So there is data in this sort of gap here, but I wasn't prepared to pay the sort of $500, $700 that you need to pay to buy the report to actually extract the data. So the distribution looks kind of weird, but it's pretty clear that there's a positive, significant relationship. If we just restrict it to look at this area here where I do have annual data, then you can see there's a very clear link between the number of fast food establishments in the US and the prevalence of obesity. And that's been enough for people to charge the fast food industry with being responsible for the obesity epidemic. And so there's been an awful lot of people just completely convinced by that linkage. But we should be cautious, because what we're talking about is a correlation, and there may be lots of other things that have changed over time that could also be a causal factor. So here's another potential causal factor that might be a cause of obesity. And actually, if you look at this graph at the bottom over here, what you can see is that there's a phenomenal relationship between this factor and obesity prevalence. So what is it? Anybody, any ideas? It's actually air travel. It's the number of thousands of passenger air miles. And the reason that I showed this was because what I wanted to say was, of course, nobody would suggest that air travel causes obesity. But in fact, somebody has done. So when I looked just to check that nobody had actually made that suggestion, there was an article in the New York Times last year that said that air travel actually potentially makes you obese. And what they said was that frequent flyers are on average 4.5 kilos heavier than average. But when I read the article, it turned out that the definition of a frequent flyer was somebody who flies more than 21 days per month. 21 days, that's not a frequent flyer, that's a pilot. So the levels that we're talking about, it doesn't, flying does not cause obesity at the level that we're talking about. So the question that we sort of came into this was how can we test if something is causal or if it's just a temporal coincidence? So we assume that the fast food relationship is causal, and we assume that the air travel relationship is just a temporal coincidence. Anything going up over time is going to be linked to obesity. How can we test between them? So of course you can't, but there are some things that you can do. And so what the argument we made was that if something is causal, then we not only expect a temporal relationship, but we also expect a spatial relationship. And you can see that here. If you look at these maps, so these are the CDC maps by county in the US for the rates of diabetes and obesity. And what you can see is that if you squint your eyes, you can see those distributions look the same. And so there's a spatial correspondence. So what we thought was, okay, if there's a causal link between obesity and fast food restaurants, then there should also be a spatial link between them as well. So what we did was we got the data for all the counties in the mainland US. We looked at the obesity data. So this is the data that the CDC collected. We then collected fast food data from the USDA. And then we looked at lots of potential confounding factors from the census. So basically, what I'm saying here is the data is publicly available data. It's collected by the US government, but it's pretty good data. It's not, some guy going around and counting restaurants. So one question you might ask is then, is counted the correct spatial scale to look for associations? And the way that you check that is you do something called a variogram analysis, where you look for correlations between target places and the areas that surround them. And basically what we find is that there's no spatial correlation at that sort of stepping level. So basically, counties are effectively independent as far as obesity is concerned. So what do you find? Well, this is the raw data. So basically, this is age-corrected obesity prevalence across 3,000 counties in the US against the number of fast food restaurants per 1,000 population. And you don't have to be very smart to see that there's a negative relationship. So in other words, the more fast food restaurants there are in a county, the lower the rate of obesity. So we could draw the conclusion then that fast food makes you thin, and obviously the industry would be pretty pleased with that, but I think there's a bit of a problem with that analysis. So there's two important confounding factors here. So the first one is poverty. The poorer people are in an area, the greater the obesity rate, and the other one is education. So the more educated people are in an area, the lower the rate of obesity. And interestingly, if you look at what fast food restaurant owners do, where do they put their restaurants? Well, interestingly, they put them in areas where people are marginally richer. You can kind of understand that. People have got more disposable income, that's where you want to put a restaurant. But they also put them in areas where people are more educated. So that was a little kind of unexpected. But the consequence of that is that you then get that spurious relationship coming out. So if we correct for those two factors, then there's a negative relationship still there. It's still significant because we're talking 3,000 data points. But if you then remove any additional potential confounders, like how many people are unemployed, what's the access to recreation facilities, all things that are related to affluence, if you get rid of all those things, then there's zero relationship. There's absolutely no spatial linkage. And you can actually see that. So these are the maps for the distribution of obesity and the distribution of fast food restaurants. So look, this is where people are mostly obese, around here in the deep south, and that's not an area where there's particularly many fast food restaurants. So there's no relationship between these two things at the spatial level. What about those 144 places where there are no fast food restaurants? Obesity rates are exactly the same. So having no access to fast food doesn't make you thin. It just has zero impact. So in conclusion then, once the confounders related to affluence are removed, fast food densities show no spatial relationship to the prevalence of obesity. And I'm not saying they don't cause obesity, but I think that's a sufficiently interesting basis to question this widely held notion that fast food is a causal factor. It's important you remember, I have no links to the fast food industry and no vested interest in the outcome of this research. And if you're really interested in looking at it, there's a few papers that were in AJCN. Okay, so these are the guys that I have the sort of pleasure to work with every day. And in particular, one guy was really instrumental in this work, and that's Mohsen Mazidi. And he's an Iranian guy who's just about to go on and do a postdoc in Sweden, but he's a sort of talented guy for the future. And these are the guys who gave us the money. Thank you very much. 2 seconds to hit it down. No questions? Really questioning audience today. Oh, there's one there.
We have to have one question, John. That was a great presentation, enormous fun. What about motor cars in America? They don't eat in the same county where they live, do they?
Yeah, good point. And I have a slide about that. So what if people eat outside the county where they live? So what we could do is we could just look in a state, and then we could actually say, well, okay, let's take one of these counties and not only count the number of restaurants that are within that county, but actually all the ones that are in the neighboring counties as well. And that's a distance of about 30, 40 miles in any direction, which I think most people don't drive that distance to eat. And so we can take another place and we can repeat that through the entire place. And when we do that, it makes no difference to the relationship. So I don't think that's the answer. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Stefan Lehn. I'm from Belgium. Sorry, I would like to make a comment. I think this is an ecological study. Would you agree on that?
Yeah.
Because you look at an aggregate level. So we know that ecological studies, they do not give us any information on causation. Would you agree on that?
Absolutely. That's what I said at the beginning. We can't infer causality. All I'm saying is that if something is causal, you would expect it to be spatially associated. Somebody's eating that food. You know, there are some places that have 10 times the number of fast food restaurants. Who's eating all that food?
I would think it's rather dangerous to question something that is supposed to be causal. on the basis of a study that has a design that does not allow you to give a causal association.
Absolutely. I'm not, what I'm saying though is that if I was standing here and saying there is a relationship, I would be inferring causality. I'm not inferring causality, I'm inferring lack of causality. And the absence of a correlation can be used to infer the absence of a causal relationship. Okay. Thank you very much.
All right, our next speaker is Ted Kyle, and he's going to be speaking about comparative analysis of explicit weight bias in the UK and 8 other countries.
I'd like to start by thanking Penny for organizing this and being so gracious as to invite me, and thank the organizers of ECO. It's amazing how they bring this together. My disclosures are here, professional consulting fees as well as personal biases that I hold that I think are important to acknowledge. And I'd also like to acknowledge grant support to the OAC to be able to do this research from Novo Nordisk, and the very valuable collaboration and contributions of these people listed here who helped make this possible. A little bit of background. First, competing narratives affect our ideas about obesity interventions and how we approach the problem. Paul Thibodeau did some research on prevalent narratives about obesity and came up with 4 that seem to be dominant. One of a moral failure, a disgusting failure of personal responsibility, one of addiction, people getting hooked on junk food, a toxic environment with too much healthy food, and impossibility of exercise, and then a medical narrative that says we are blaming, not helping people with this condition. Pervasive bias is important because it hampers clinical care and obesity-related policy. Blaming people with obesity gets in the way of clinical care, sets up a dysfunctional medical dialogue. And some of the key elements of bias against people with obesity that were factored into the attitudes that we assessed include blame directed at people with obesity, assumptions that people with obesity are lazy or lack discipline, and then the social rejection of people with obesity. I wouldn't be comfortable if someone with obesity were to marry one of my close relatives. I would not be comfortable hiring somebody with obesity, even in countries where that's illegal. Those are key elements that we looked at. And so we have this ongoing study of biases about obesity and people living with it. We are collecting data on public attitudes in Australia, Brazil, Canada, both English-speaking and French-speaking Canadians. We sampled them separately: Germany, Italy, Mexico, Sweden, the UK, and the US. We assess agreement with different narratives. We assess agreement with explicit beliefs about people with obesity. And we look for potential differences among the countries that we surveyed, and we're also hoping to monitor trends. I don't have any data on trends here. In terms of methods, we used web and smartphone samples obtained via Google surveys. We got responses from a total of more than 90,000 respondents, and that number is high because we only asked people to answer one question each. When you're asking questions about sensitive subjects, people get fatigued very, very quickly and start giving you dishonest answers. And so that's not good. If you've ever gone onto a website that interrupted you and said, if you want to keep reading this website, answer a quick question for us, please. That's exactly how we collected the data. As I mentioned, each respondent answered only one question. We had 18 of the questions. We gave them 5-point Likert scales, asking their agreement with these 4 different narratives about obesity, asking questions about blame, social acceptance, laziness, and self-discipline people with obesity. And we got a minimum of 500 respondents for each question in each country and language that we assessed. So 4 results, and I have 7 minutes left, so I'm going to be fairly brief about this. In terms of an overall response that just jumped out at us, people across the world, and this relates to the presentation that Dr. Speakman just gave, really favor the idea that addiction is an explanation for obesity. In Italy, it was 70% of the public said that obesity is a problem of addictive junk food. The U.S. had the least agreement with that, but even so, 39% of Americans said that this is a problem that has its roots in addictive junk food, and only 30% disagreed with that idea. We had 31% sitting there in the middle saying, maybe, maybe not, I don't know. This analysis of odds ratios for agreement with the addiction narrative comes from a cumulative logit model that Krista Watts at the U.S. Military Academy developed for us. And the U.S. is the reference index for this analysis. And what this shows you is, along with other analyses that we did, we found that the agreement with that addiction explanation was especially strong in Brazil, among French-speaking Canadians, and in Italy. You see there, Brazil is respondents from Brazil were about 3 times more likely to tell us that it's a problem of addiction than respondents in the U.S. Respondents in Italy likewise responded very much in favor of that. And we single out French-speaking Canadians here, even though they scored a little bit, although not significantly less likely to say that it's a problem, because when you compare that to how they agreed with the other narratives, it came out as more important. They agreed more with that narrative than with the other narratives. And likewise, Mexico, although they agreed with this narrative a lot, they agreed with all the other narratives. They were quite an agreeable sample. And so we were really looking for, what stood head and shoulders above, and it was in those 3 countries where it was particularly strong. Only in the U.S. and the U.K. did respondents believe in the narrative of irresponsibility, a disgusting failure of personal responsibility, as the explanation for obesity, as much as they believed in the other explanations. You can see here that it was on par. In this particular graph, the baseline is how much they agreed with irresponsibility. They agreed no more with addiction or with the environmental narrative. And they said that this medical narrative, at least in the UK, they said it, that medical narrative is nonsense. They relatively speaking, rejected that. Likewise, in the US, they said these are all alike. So those are the places where people were really thinking, this is very much a problem of personal responsibility. Now, across all measures, and here I have the aggregate measure on blame. We asked blame several different ways, and we aggregated it. The U.S. is the reference baseline. You see that respondents in the UK and Mexico and Australia were more likely to blame people with obesity. But then when you go across all of the other measures, and unfortunately in just 3 minutes left, I can't show you all 18 measures, but across all measures, the UK always came up in the top tier of harsh beliefs about people with obesity, and I would include in that their response to the idea of obesity being the result of a disgusting failure of personal responsibility. So, in summary, and it looks like I'm going to leave you with a few extra minutes here. Penny put the fear of God in us, so I'm happy to answer your questions. But we saw that public beliefs related to weight bias were really varied among these 9 different populations that we studied. We found that belief in addictive junk food, even though scientifically that's still a matter of controversy, belief in addictive junk food causing obesity is very strong really everywhere we looked. Some places stronger than others, but everywhere we went, people said, yeah, that makes sense to me. I believe that. It's all that addictive junk food that's killing us. That belief was especially strong in Italy and French-speaking Canada. We also found that the harshest beliefs about people with obesity were in the UK, and some of the least harsh beliefs were found among French-speaking Canadians. Again, here I'm speaking about the overall pattern of responses and not just a single response. On just about every measure, the UK came up at the very top of harshness. So if you happen to want these slides, you can download them at this link and find more information at Conscient Health, and I'm happy for any questions that you might have. Questions? Okay. Give you back some time.
All right, thank you, Ted. Okay, our next speaker is Arnie Astrup, and he'll be speaking on personalized dietary management of obesity based on simple biomarkers.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the invitation to join this session. Now, let me start with my conflicts of interest, and the entire list can be found on the website if you want to go into more details. Now, when we look at weight losses, when we put people on a diet, this is an example from the New Nordic diet, where it's a weight loss achieved at libitum of this New Nordic diet, which is somewhat similar to the Mediterranean diet. And we'll see that there's quite some variability in the weight loss achieved. And what is interesting is really that we have been unable to really at priori to identify those who are very successful and to distinguish them from those who are not losing weight or even gaining weight. And I think this is really the challenge to find out. But I think we have started to get an idea about what's going on. And I think some of the concepts of this is really that glucose and insulin and glucose metabolism seems to be, we have been knowing for decades that the glucostatic concept, that glucose uptake in the brain is an important signal for hunger and satiety. But I think it's probably more important that we have been aware of. And what we have seen now is that it really looks like that insulin resistance in the brain is an important determinant for the carbohydrate-induced satiety and ability to lose weight based on depending on the diet composition. And those who are more insulin resistant are less carbohydrate tolerant, and they are more relying on the gut hormones that provide them satiety based on the content of protein and fats in the diet. I'll just show you a recent study that was published I find very interesting, that in this study they actually measured the brain glucose level during an infusion of let me just see here, we have a pointer. We had a group of lean, obese, and type 2 diabetics. And they were all infused to have a hypoglycemia of about 12 millimolar per liter, and were also provided accordingly with insulin to keep that level. And what we could see is that this is in the normal insulin-sensitive subjects, that they had a quite substantial increase in the glucose uptake and brain levels, whereas with the somewhat insulin-resistant obese, they had a diminished uptake, and in the type 2 diabetics, it was even less. And they actually also found that there was an association between the glucose uptake in the brain and fullness scores. So I think this supports the idea that the brain uptake of glucose is quite an important determinant of satiety. And you can illustrate it in this way here, that that we have the different subjects here, that if you compare with the normal subjects, so when you are challenged with carbohydrates, in this case by glucose infusion, of course, that the obese, they only have a 33% uptake compared with the normal weight, and the type 2 diabetics, it's only half of it. So if this should translate into some clinically relevant, we should expect the obese and even more the type 2 diabetics to have a weaker satiety signal when they ingest carbohydrates. And we've been working with some of the clinical trials where we actually have reanalyzed many of these trials to see if this is true. So what we did was really to take again some of the old studies. This is a European multi-center trial we did way back, where we randomized 771 obese patients to either a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet or a high-fat, low-carb diet for just 10 weeks. It was a hypocaloric diet intervention. And what we published in 2006 was that there was absolutely no difference between the weight loss between the two diets. They lost about 7 kilos. So that was the conclusion, that diet composition doesn't matter, it's all about calories. You've heard that before. But now when we tried actually to split them into, at baseline, into the normal glycemic, the pre-diabetic, and the type 2 diabetics, simply based on their fasting glucose, and now we saw a completely different picture. Now, this is the difference between the weight loss on the low-fat diet and on the high-fat diet. So 0 here means 7 kilo weight loss. And what you can see here is that the normal glycemic, they actually lost a little bit more weight on the low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet, whereas the type 2 diabetics, they lost more weight, 7 plus the 2 kilo, they lost about 9 kilo, so they lost more on the high-fat, low-carb diet. So in some way, that really fits with the idea that type 2 diabetics, they don't get the same satiety on the high-carb diet, so therefore they lose more weight on a low-carb diet, where they are relying on the protein and fat. Now, this is not a very big study. There wasn't that many type 2 diabetics. What we also did was to look at their fasting insulin. And fasting insulin is actually a marker for insulin secretion capacity and is correlating quite well with postprandial insulin. So what we can see here is that the pre-diabetics who had a low insulin, they also did much better on the high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, suggesting that their capacity to overcome the insulin resistance is weaker. Now, we were interested to look in a much bigger trial, and you are probably familiar with the Predimed trial, the Spanish large-scale trial that was not a weight loss trial at all. They looked at the effect on the Mediterranean diet supplemented with olive oil and nuts and almonds on cardiovascular heart endpoints. And they randomized about 8,000 into a low-fat diet or this Mediterranean diet with more fat for 5 years. And they actually also published the weight loss results and showed that there was no difference between the arms in terms of weight loss. But now when we reanalyzed the data in collaboration with the Spanish colleagues and stratified the participants into based on their fasting glucose, you will see here that we had 3 groups. This is the American unit, so this is a normal glycemic. These are the diabetics. And these 2 are 2 different levels of pre-diabetics. And we can see there was a spontaneous weight reduction, a weight loss, occurring over these 5 years for the diabetics and the pre-diabetics with the high glucose that occurred on the high-fat diet over the 5 years. So this is quite consistent with the concept that for the diabetics, you will see probably more satiety and a greater weight loss, even though it was an ad libitum diet over 5 years. We have also done studies or reanalyzed study where we have looked more at normal glycemics versus pre-diabetics. And this is from the Diogenes study, this European multi-center trial where we started with obese patients who lost about 11 kilos on a low-caloric diet, and then were randomized to different diets ad libitum. And in 2 of the centers, they got all the food free of charge from our supermarket for 6 months, really to ensure that they were sticking to the diet because everything was free. And that enabled us to use the barcode scanners for checking the diet composition, what they put in the basket. And what we'll share with you here is they lost about 11 kilos over the first 8 weeks here on the low-fat, high-carbohydrate, the low-calorie diet. And then they were randomized to different diets, and I'll share with you the high glycemic load versus low glycemic load. And the lower glycemic load was based on a little less carb and also lower glycemic index of the foods, which essentially is more fiber-rich food, more vegetables instead of fruit. But when we published these results in New England Journal of Medicine, you could see after the 11 kilo weight loss, those who got the low glycemic load diet was actually able to maintain this weight loss, even though it was ad libitum, this diet. So it was more satiating, whereas this high glycemic load diet caused, they started to regain about 2 kilos over these 6 months. But now we reanalyzed the data and looked first at the normal glycemic ones, and we could see that there was only maybe a 1 kilo difference. So this difference in glycemic load and in carbohydrates was not really that important for the normal glycemic obese. Whereas when we look at the pre-diabetic, there was a pronounced effect of this. So after 6 months, there was more than 6 kilo weight difference on an ad libitum diet. So it's telling us if you're pre-diabetic, you will start to gain weight on a high glycemic load diet, whereas if you get a low glycemic load diet, you will actually continue to lose weight even though it's ad libitum, whereas it has minor effect in the normal glycemic obese. We had the opportunity actually to confirm these results in this trial I mentioned before, the New Nordic diet, where it was also using this supermarket where we provided all the food free of charge for 6 months. And then the New Nordic diet, we increased the intake of fruit, vegetables, root vegetables, and whole grain, and didn't pay that much attention on the macronutrients really. And what we found here was, when we published the results, that there was a small weight loss in the control group, but with the New Nordic diet, ad libitum diet, it was so satiating that they actually lost about 3 kilos more over 6 months. But now when we reanalyzed the data, we actually found, again, this dramatic difference, that for the normal glycemic ones, whether they got the control or the New Nordic diet, did only produce a very small weight loss, but for the pre-diabetics, it made really a substantial difference, quite a large weight loss, exactly as we saw in the Diogenes trial. Now we are reanalyzing many other trials, and we have actually published some of them. We are looking at the pounds lost and others, and just to ensure that this is something, some biomarkers that can be used globally. So I think we will end up with a kind of this interesting finding that if you are a normal glycemic obese, it's still the low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. And of course, it's always good to have fiber and whole grain, no doubt about that. But it's not really that important for the weight loss and satiety effect. Whereas for the diabetics, type 2 diabetes, it's exactly the opposite. So a lot of carbohydrates is fine here because it's coming straight into the brain and give you satiety. But for the type 2 diabetics, it's the opposite. You need to restrict carbohydrates, and particularly to ensure some of the better carbohydrates, the low glycemic ones and more fiber. And for the pre-diabetics, I think it's probably not extremely important whether it's high or low in fat, but no doubt about that the fiber is doing a lot here, and we have more trials to show that we can see that the fiber content is extremely important for the weight control among the pre-diabetics. And so I think my conclusion is that based on these different studies and also some of the mechanistic studies, that fasting glucose and insulin can actually be used to choose the right diet for the right obese individuals. It can be measured before the treatment is started. And I think it's adding some evidence to support that one diet fits all is not a good strategy. And particularly when we move into type 2 diabetes, it's a problem. So I think this can be used as a starting point for further development into the personalized weight management. And let me thank my co-worker, Mads Hjort, who has been doing most of the analysis here, is actually present in the audience. So if you have some very difficult questions for me, I will hand them over to him. Thank you for your attention. Okay. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. Our final speaker in the session, and then we'll open the floor for more of a discussion, and hopefully we'll hear more from the audience during the discussion. Now we'll hear from Dr. Barquera on regulatory efforts to prevent obesity in Mexico and Chile.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Penny, for the invitation to the symposium. I'm going to talk of two experiences in obesity prevention policies in Latin America. These are my co-authors from the National Institute of Public Health and also from the INTA in Chile. And these are my disclosures of some conferences and a project that I have in Mexico City in the National Institute of Public Health. As you know, Mexico is one of the countries with highest prevalence of obesity and overweight. During the last 30 years, we have been increasing the prevalence, and right now, 70% of all adults are obesity or overweight in the country. And this is similar for most Latin American countries that have a prevalence of obesity and overweight above 50%. In Mexico, this comes also with a very important increase in diabetes mortality. Basically, at the end of the year 2000, there was an inflection point in which diabetes started to increase a lot. Now it's the first cause of mortality. We have 14 million Mexicans living with diabetes, and about 100,000 people die from diabetes each year in Mexico. So it has been declared a national epidemiologic alert. These alerts that are only declared for infectious diseases is now declared in Mexico, and I understand that this is the only country that has an epidemiological alert for chronic diseases. And as you can see in this picture, we are one of the countries with highest mortality due to diabetes. And the picture looks very similar to the picture of sugary beverage consumption in the world. We are one of the countries with highest consumption of sugary beverages. So let me show you some pictures so you can see more or less how is the food environment in Mexico. We have a very high availability of very low quality junk food, almost in every corner of the country. And we have a lot of strategies in the purchasing points to make consumers take bad decisions, unhealthy decisions. So price discounts, gifts, images, incentives. And also a lot of marketing to children in stores and outside schools, and basically in TV, in all the media that you can imagine, and even very creative ways to convince consumers to change their decisions from healthy to unhealthy ones. So this is the food environment in which we started to try to identify possibilities of policy to modify the environment and make easier for consumers to have healthy diets. Sports teams and also in active sport areas and parks is also very common to have this. So one of the first things we did is to try to model how will be the elasticity of a 10% tax on sugary beverages, and we found that it was of around a 10% reduction, and this is one of the first articles we published in 2008. And very, very late in 2014, after maybe 10 years of trying to push for a soda tax, it was finally approved by the government for different reasons. There was good evidence of the impact on health of sugary beverages. Also, there was this epidemic, and Mexico was the highest consumer of sugar-sweetened beverage in the world. But the most important, we had a very important economic crisis in 2013, and the government needed the revenue. And there was a lot of support from civil society for the initiative. So in 2014, there was, this soda tax was approved in the country. And it's a soda tax that is 1 peso per liter, excise tax. It's only for sugary beverages. The tax was paid by the producers, and it was equivalent to about 10% increase in price. And the cost in US dollars is 0.05 US dollars per liter. And the results after 2 years of evaluation was a 7.6 reduction in the consumption, which was good for the small tax. With reductions were higher among low socioeconomic status people, higher in urban areas than in rural areas, and sales of bottled water increased. And other evaluations that we have done, such as simulation studies, have shown that a 6% reduction in sugary beverages will lead to a 2.5% reduction in obesity and save up to 86,000 cases of diabetes. And the tax was not associated with losses in employment in beverage industry and stores. This is more or less the two studies that we have exploring the effect of the tax on consumption during 2014 and 2015, and as you can see, there was an important reduction. Obviously, we recommended a tax of 20%, so the effect is not great, but it was good, 7.6 reduction, or 5 liters per year per capita. And this was used as a model by many other countries to propose better soda taxes with some other options. We also did a modeling study in which we found that it could reduce up to 190,000 diabetic cases, and also to have important savings, 993,000 US dollars. So these were some of the effects. And now, comparing to the soda tax in Chile, Chile already have taxes for food, which Mexico did not have. So they increased from 13% to 18% for sugary beverages above 6.25 grams. But decreased the soda tax to 10% for beverages below that point. They have studies on price elasticity that show that it's elastic, so a 10% increase will produce a reduction of 10%, and they have not evaluated impact. And in Berkeley, in the city in the US, they have a tax of 0.34 US dollars per liter, excise tax, so it's much higher than the tax in Mexico, and the tax is paid by distributors, and it has produced in 1 year evaluation 9.6% reduction in sales after in this year, and 3.5 increase in untaxed beverages, and an increase in bottled water. It has also not been associated with losses in store revenues. So this is a very important tax that in the recent series of Lancet on Economics and NCD has been recognized as a very powerful tool to prevent chronic diseases. And the other thing I want to talk about is front-of-pack labeling. In Chile, they developed these black octagons that are called warning labels that say high sugar, high fat, high sodium, and high calories. And in Mexico, we have the GDAs. It's a model developed by food industry that is very hard to understand, with 5 circles and 9 quantities that basically nobody understands. We have evaluated this in the national survey, and only less than 20% of the population declares they use the GDA label system in Mexico. In Chile, they have great evaluations of this system, and it can be even understood by children and by most of the population. So this is a very interesting experience. In Mexico, after investing millions of pesos in making the public understand this GDA system, nobody declared in this nationally representative study that we did in collaboration with the University of Waterloo, only 54% understood the front of pack, compared to 83% the Chilean system, which nobody has seen before that test. So that shows how important it is to have a good way to inform consumers about, to help consumers to take better decisions and choices. And this is an example. This is a salty snack, and this is the information they give to consumers in Mexico, and this is the information that they give to consumers in Chile, obviously with much better results. And this is other advance that Chile has. They have also improved a lot the marketing directed to children. So you can see the same product in Mexico and in Chile. In Chile without the character, and also with the big black octagons that are warning about high sugar and high calories. And in Mexico, with this label that nobody understands below, and also with the character and sponsorships and other links to websites, etc. So this is something that we really need to modify. An expert committee has recommended to use this kind of system in Mexico, and many other countries are adopting it, such as Peru, Ecuador, Brazil, Canada, and Mexico, hopefully soon. And finally, to close, I want to show you another topic that is causing a lot of interference with policies to prevent obesity in Mexico. There was this observatory made by, with society to take decisions about obesity prevention policies. And as you can see in red, half of the chairs are occupied by food industry-related organizations. And this has produced a lot of interference in the policies in the last 6 years. This model is being exported to other Latin American countries. So there are countries that are implementing this observatory with all the actors of society, and we're recommending they don't do it because it's really a problem. This is one of the organizations that is represented in this observatory, and as you can see, most of these big food companies and big soda are represented, and many of them produces sugary beverages, and many of them produces junk food also. So in conclusion, evidence and research must be ready for policy windows. The soda tax in Mexico was approved because there was a big economic crisis, but we have all the information ready years before, because we were pushing for this tax since 2008. And the international collaboration was also very important and necessary in the case of Chile and Mexico to approve their initiatives. Soda tax are now being recognized as a very effective policy to reduce consumption of sugary beverages. The warning levels in Chile are useful to promote healthier choices and are becoming the gold standard, at least in Latin America. And preventing industry interference is an important step to succeed implementing obesity prevention policies. Thank you.
Will Johnson from Loughborough, UK, and thanks for a great talk. You reported some nice results of the soda tax on various outcomes. Do you think part of the problem is the price of water as well, and that you'd get better outcomes if you decreased the price of bottled water?
Yes, I think, at least in my experience in Latin America, in many cases you cannot give such a low price in water as you give in sugary beverages with the promotions that they add. So definitely incentives to reduce price of water will help a lot.
Thank you very much for this talk. I wonder if you have also implemented taxes for the beverages with artificial sweeteners, because we also have good data that they're also related to the increased prevalence of obesity.
Yes, in Mexico we have not, our tax was the first one just targeted to sugary beverages, but it has some problems. It is very little, and it's only to sugary beverages with caloric sugary beverages. It excludes 100% juices, but I think the Philadelphia soda tax includes all beverages, including artificial sweeteners, which I think is a good idea given recent studies on effects on appetite.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I thank the panel for a set of very elegant presentations, and now we'll have all of the speakers come up, and we'll just make a little panel here and allow people to ask questions. And as everyone is coming up, I would just like to say a couple of words from the presentation. Actually, I think using John's presentation as sort of the hook. I think when we think about obesity, we have to think about the complexity. And so when we think about whether or not fast food restaurants in an environment affect weight status, we have to think about all the steps that go between just having that food store in your neighborhood to actually coming to consume it. And there's also from Ted's talk, I think the feeling about weight bias and thinking that there's going to be preferences for fast food across the weight spectrum. And so there are thin people who are going to love fast food. There are people who are heavier. There's just going to be a lot of diversity in who wants to eat fast food. And then I think from Arnie's talk, hearing that there's also very different susceptibilities, and those susceptibilities can be biological, but going back to John's, they could also be socioeconomic. So whether or not someone is consuming the food in and of itself may or may not be the predisposing factor. The internal mechanisms of how that food is processed and used and desired are likely playing a very big role. And then from Simone's talk, also important to think about the person as consumer and what they're confronted with in the purchasing decisions and the messages that they see and how that shapes what they wind up consuming. So I think that summarizes a bit of what we did, and I don't know if the panelists want to weigh in or if we can open the floor, but go ahead. And are these mics on?
Can you hear me? Yeah, I think that it's on. It's just a question for you, Simon. I was very curious about if you have been able to see there was any changes in the prevalence of obesity and overweight in Mexico after you started this taxation.
Well, it has been only 2 years since the implementation, and the estimated effect is per capita is about 6 calorie reduction per day. So it's very small, but even with that, the national consumption of sugar, if you estimate it, is a lot. It's thousands of sugar tons per year reduction. So, but we will need maybe like 10 years to have an effect.
I think it's simply because if your prediction is based on that this reduction in caloric intake will not be compensated by eating something else, and that's hard to know. I probably tend to agree with you that this will be the case, but it would be nice to see that this prediction is actually also turning into a reduction in overweight.
We modeled in the predictions caloric compensation of 10%, 39%, and 100% caloric compensation, and you still have benefits because the reduction in consumption of sugar has benefits even without the direct effect through body mass index.
All right, Luis, go ahead.
Louise Bauer, University of Sydney. That was a tremendous session. Thank you very much. I maybe just a couple of questions to get things going. Simone, very, very interesting to see your data. I wonder if you have any data, or is there any possibility of looking at data on dental caries and what may change over time in Mexico? That would be a really interesting co-benefit to look at. And maybe I could ask Penny to then maybe comment, if you remember after the discussion there, if you could just reflect on transport changes and things such as active transport change. Is that different from occupation transport, and if you could reflect on those issues. Thank you.
So in China, we find occupation-related activity really to be the predominant change that we see. That's where not just the biggest changes in terms of activity level, but also the strongest associations with weight and weight-related outcomes. So it seems like that's where the action is. For women, domestic labor does, those reductions are really quite extreme as well. But for active leisure, for active transit, it's hard because it's so infrequent and it's hard to capture relative to the other components. So.
We are not evaluating dental health in the national surveys, but there are some groups that are trying to identify databases to do this study. I agree that this could be also a very interesting aspect to evaluate from the stall attacks.
Hi, thanks for a great session. I was really interested in John's talk, and I sort of intuitively understand the idea that if you expect or you find a temporal association, you would expect a spatial association. But then part of me is also thinking that if you observe a spatial association for a cohort born, say, in the last 5 years, that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't been a temporal association, i.e. I would still expect that fast food restaurants to have contributed to the obesity epidemic, even if you don't observe a spatial association now. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the way that I kind of look at it is that the contemporary part of that graph, there's still a relationship happening between densities of fast food restaurants in time. So between 2002 and 2016, there's still a relationship. So we would still expect in 2012, when all the data that I presented spatially, we would still kind of expect there to be a spatial relationship. So it's not like historically there was a temporal relationship and it's now gone. It's still actually happening at the moment. But I think the way to look at it is this, that these restaurants are all pretty much the same size. They're not enormously different. So if you have 10 times the number of restaurants in an area, all the areas have about 65,000 people in. That food's going somewhere. Somebody must be eating that food. It's not being thrown away. It's actually being consumed. And yet, there's no difference in the obesity between those populations. So that, as far as I'm concerned, is the real kind of bottom line here. There are actual restaurants selling actual hamburgers, and it's having zero effect on the numbers of people that are obese.
I guess, just to follow up, I guess my point was, do you think your findings, your spatial findings, rule out the fact or the idea that the increase in fast food restaurants has contributed to the secular increase in obesity over the last 40 years?
No, I don't think you can extend it to that.
One question also for you, John. Did you control for the volume of sales in the restaurants, or is it just density of restaurants? Because it can be that in low income, they sell 10 times more, and it's the same number of restaurants.
We didn't, that data's not available.
Mike Lean here again. John, just a very simple thing. I think the obesity figures you were using were adult obesity?
Yes.
But perhaps in fast food restaurants, a lot of children eat the food.
Yep.
So I have a question for Simon. I think we're all waiting to know whether the change in behavior, the consumption of sugar-containing beverages, will be reflected in weight change, or whether the increased sweetness of the alternatives will stimulate the appetite for snack foods and continue the increase in weight. We need to know this information. If you want to reduce the consumption of sugary beverages or even sweetened ones, did you consider banning caffeine, which is only there because it's addictive? Caffeine is added to these drinks. In Europe, it's added because it is theoretically a flavouring, but it has no flavour in the concentration used. It's added because, and Boyd Swinburne showed some data showing that adding caffeine in a randomized controlled trial increased consumption, I think, by 10 or 15%. So if you want to reduce reduction, why not remove the caffeine? That costs nothing.
Yes, that's a very important idea, especially because Mexico is like the second consumer of Coke, so particularly caffeine beverage. But when we tried to reduce the level of caffeine of the Red Bull, there was a big important trade problem in Mexico. So I don't think the Ministry of Health wants to mess with caffeine for a while. So we will need to be working a lot on that.
I don't think that's a good idea, because there's actually quite good data to support that caffeine is producing a slight weight loss. There's very good data from the Nurses' Health Study showing that those who had an increase in caffeine intake over years had a less weight gain over years, and we actually did a randomized trial for 6 months, double-blind placebo control with caffeine, and it actually showed it produced a small, significant fat loss.
Fascinating. I still think it would be an interesting idea to see what happens to consumption of sweetened beverages if you remove the caffeine. It would cost nothing.
Of course, the interaction.
You can transfer it into the water.
So I have a question for Arnie. Are you doing any interventions with baseline glucose or insulin?
Yeah, first of all, when we wanted when we started to design some trials, we realized that these trials they already existed with all the measurements, but nobody have analyzed them and stratified them according to baseline glucose and insulin. So we think ethically and economically it doesn't make sense to start to do new trials when they have already been done. So now we are collaborating with the Pounds Lost and also with Christopher Gardner's trial to reanalyze them and look at fiber, etc. But we are planning to do new trials where we actually start and also have some more sophisticated measurements. We're also doing the microbiota where we can see that there are some very important predictors based on the microbiota. So there might be some important interactions between glucose metabolism and the microbiota. So, but I think it seems to be quite robust, our findings across different trials and different populations. The only important thing is really that there's a good adherence to the diet composition. Otherwise, if people are all eating the same in different arms, it's a little tricky. So I think the most robust findings is really where we have provided all the foods free of charge for 6 months to the entire family, because there we know exactly what they're eating. But this is a tricky part of dietary interventions. But I think it also solves that when you see that randomized trial with low fat versus low carb, that there's essentially no difference. But then when you reanalyze, you suddenly see huge differences depending on your pre-treatment glycemic status.
Interesting. Planning to ask you to comment on this low carb diets on obese diabetic patients. As far as I know, no national or international guidelines recommend that amount of carbohydrates in diet. Do you think that we use in general more than we should use and consume carbohydrates in our daily routine diets? I mean, that ratio, 35% you mentioned. Should it be the normal range that we consume in our normal lives?
Well, I think current recommendations for carbohydrate intake makes a lot of sense for the normal glycemic part of the population, but the more you move into the diabetic and the pre-diabetic, and particularly the diabetic population, you should cut down on total carbs and put much more attention to the quality of the carbs. And for the pre-diabetics, the quality of the carbs with the fiber content seems to be extremely important. So I think our recommendations are probably very good and based for the normal weight and also the overweight with the normal glycemic population. But the more you move into this insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, you need to simply to take into consideration that the satiety effect is not as good for them. So it's a kind of carbohydrate intolerant and it also affects the appetite, the satiety. But I think we need much more, mechanistic studies. So also to try to really understand the mechanism. The brain part is one of them, but it could also be the uptake in muscles and liver and fat that actually send signals to the brain. There's so much we don't know yet.
I'm asking this because there is a growing interest in ketogenic diets in the overall population, and we do not have long-term data, but short-term data takes into this point, low carb.
Yeah, I think the predimate where we have 5 years data on ad-lib diets clearly show that there's no weight loss except in the diabetics and also the pre-diabetics with low insulin. They start to lose weight automatically. And I think that's really, something I believed in for 30 years, that the diet composition is important for your appetite control, and you can achieve a reduction in spontaneous caloric intake by making changes. But of course I've been confused by the low fat, low carb, but suddenly we can see why there is this conflicting evidence. It's simply because it depends on who you are.
Thank you.
Okay, and I have one question for Ted. Are you going to follow your people? I'm just curious. There seems to be some positive changes in media and otherwise around weight bias. I'm just wondering, are you going to follow any of these countries to see what, how things change over time?
That is our intent. We've tracked data for a little bit more than a year in all of these countries so far, and we tend to continue tracking that data. We have also been tracking data on these attitudes in the U.S. for quite some time, and what we have seen is a significant trend away from the belief in disgusting irresponsibility as being the root cause of obesity in the U.S. We see some other trends that are encouraging, but change in these kinds of attitudes are very slow. There are a number of things that we think might fuel those trends, but we think that it's important to keep tracking on them because, as illustrated by this group here, the public and policymakers bring a lot of presumptions to the table about what's going on. And sometimes that's all we have to work on, so we have to do, real-world experiments. But sometimes those presumptions get in the way of being a little bit more bold and figuring out what's really going on. Maybe we shouldn't be sweating fast food so much. We should be sweating marketing practices that puts food at our fingertips all day long, all the time. Who knows? But we need to be more. We need to unblind ourselves from those biases.
Well, I think that's a good point, that there's a lot of presumptions, and politicians who want to do something, they're maybe relying on something that, it's quite complex, I think therefore John's work is extremely important to try to disentangle. Do we really have evidence to say that the fast food is really to blame? And it's the same with the sugar. I could say that we cannot do much harm by putting a sugar tax, so that's okay. And the same with trans fat, etc. But I think we should be careful not to really rely on quite soft science and move that into legislation, because maybe we can do harm instead of doing something good.
Well, I think that's a good place to end. I'm sure that the speakers will stick around if anybody has one-on-one questions. But thank you very much for attending.